Hey everyone and welcome back. Today we're doing a deep dive into something I'm sure you've heard about, the SV Act.
It's definitely been making the rounds in the news cycle.
For sure. And, on the surface, it sounds pretty straightforward. You have to prove your citizenship when you register to vote in federal elections.
Right.
Makes sense.
Right. Yeah. Seems simple enough.
But then we started digging into the research for this deep dive. And, well, it's way more complicated than that.
It really is. And the article we're looking at today by Dr. Jaime Hoerricks, this academic piece, really dives deep.
Deeper than we were expecting, I think.
Oh, for sure. I mean, ready for this.
Hit me.
They connect the SAVE Act back to, wait for it, Puritanism.
Whoa. Okay, Puritanism.
Yeah, and they talk about its impact on control and exclusion in the U.S., historically, and even today.
Puritanism and voter registration.
Right. It's not the first connection that springs to mind.
Not at all. But the author argues that it's really important to understand the SAVE Act, like fully, absolutely, and to see the potential consequences, because we could be talking about millions of eligible voters being disenfranchised.
Millions.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the article focuses on how this could disproportionately impact women, especially those who have changed their names after getting married.
That's true. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, if you have to prove citizenship, but your name's changed on all your documents to match your husband's.
Oh, yeah. So you need your birth certificate and then your marriage license and then maybe even more paperwork.
Exactly. It could become this huge bureaucratic nightmare just to vote.
And for Dr. Hoerricks, this isn't just hypothetical. They actually say in the article that they and their wife might run into these problems themselves.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because of name changes and some complexities with their adoption paperwork. It just makes you realize how these seemingly simple requirements
Right, seemingly simple.
can actually create huge obstacles.
Absolutely. And this personal connection, it adds this powerful layer to their analysis.
I can see that.
Because they argue that this control through documentation isn't anything new.
Okay, so where does Puritanism come into this?
Well, Dr. Hoerricks traces this need for documentation and control all the way back to early American history and Puritanism.
So like 1600s Puritanism.
Exactly, and specifically their emphasis on social order and keeping out anyone seen as an outsider.
It's amazing to think that these ideas from centuries ago
Yeah, 400 years ago.
could still be influencing our politics today.
And shaping our laws.
It's wild. So how does the author actually connect these historical dots to something like the CV Act?
Well, they point to this core Puritan belief, maybe you've heard of it, the city on a hill idea.
I think I have, yeah.
So it's this vision of America as this chosen nation with a very specific moral order.
And everyone has to fit into that order.
Right, and anyone who doesn't is seen as a threat. So by requiring such specific documentation just to vote.
Which honestly, most people probably don't have readily accessible.
Exactly. It reinforces that dynamic, the insider versus outsider.
Yeah, I see. So this deep-seated fear of the outsider that Dr. Hoerricks talks about, it's not just some abstract historical concept. It's still alive and well in 2025.
That's the argument. And they even bring up some contemporary examples like Project 2025 and the Tradwife movement.
I've heard those terms floating around, but I don't really know what they're all about.
Right. So Project 2025 is this conservative political project to basically shrink the federal government.
Okay, shrink the government.
And a lot of people see it as an attempt to roll back social progress.
So more conservative values.
And then the Tradwife movement, as you might guess, promotes very traditional gender roles.
Okay, so women staying home, raising kids.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Okay, but I still don't see how the author ties these movements to the SAVE Act. They seem pretty different on the surface.
But according to Dr. Hoerricks, it all comes down to control and exclusion.
Okay.
They see the SI Act as part of this larger effort to restrict access to power and resources.
So who has a say in how the country's run?
Right, and who gets to make decisions? And the other movements, they're just expressions of that same ideology just playing out in different areas of life.
So it's not about voter fraud at all.
Well, that's the surface argument. But Dr. Hoerricks says it's really about maintaining a certain social order.
One that benefits certain groups.
Right. And to illustrate this point, they make this really interesting comparison to the historical restrictions on voting.
Okay, what kind of restrictions?
Back in the day, it used to be that you had to own property to be able to vote.
Like land or a house?
Yeah, and of course, women were often denied property rights.
Oh, right. So by making property ownership a requirement for voting.
They effectively excluded women from the political process.
Wow. Yeah, that's a powerful comparison.
And Dr. Hoerricks argues that the SAVE Act could function in a very similar way.
Like, it's not explicitly saying women can't vote,
but by creating these hurdles to voter registration.
You could have the same effect.
Exactly. And they specifically call out the impact on women who've changed their names because of marriage.
Like, on the surface, it seems reasonable. Got to make sure people are who they say they are.
Right. But when you dig a little deeper, you realize the consequences it could have for women.
And it's not just women. The article also mentions the impact on migrants, racial minorities, low-income individuals. It's a lot of people.
Yeah, any group that already faces systemic barriers to voting.
Dr. Hoerricks says it could make things even harder for them.
Exactly. And it all ties back to that fear of the outsider that we were talking about earlier.
So we've got this historical connection to Puritanism and these contemporary parallels to other movements. It's painting a pretty complex picture of what's at stake here.
Yeah, and then on top of all that, Dr. Hoerricks brings in this incredible story that really brings these ideas to life.
I think our listeners are ready to hear it.
Okay, so are you familiar with James Barrie?
The name rings a bell, but I don't think so.
Okay, so back in the 19th century, this woman, James Barrie, actually lived as a man so she could become a surgeon.
Wait, she had to disguise herself as a man just to be a doctor?
Yeah, it was unheard of for a woman to be a surgeon back then.
That's wild. So what happened? Did she get away with it?
And then some. She was incredibly successful, rose through the ranks of the British military medical system, all while hiding her true identity.
Can you imagine the courage that took?
I can't even imagine, but I'm
Yeah.
guessing Dr. Hoerricks didn't include this story just for the shock value.
You're right. What's the connection here?
Bro. Well, they use James Barrie's story as this lens to look at the challenges that women and marginalized groups have faced throughout history.
Like they had to go to such extremes to achieve their goals.
Exactly. And in a way, the SAVE Act is just another obstacle in a long line of obstacles that try to limit opportunities for certain groups of people.
So even though we've come a long way since the 19th century, we're still dealing with these same issues of exclusion and control.
It's like this long historical thread connecting it all.
Yeah. And Dr. Hoerricks uses Barrie's life as a way to show how these systems, even the ones that seem neutral,
Seemingly neutral.
can have this huge impact on certain groups.
Yeah, instead of just saying women can't do this or this group can't do that.
Right. It's everyone's welcome, but here are all these rules you have to follow.
Exactly. And those rules end up disproportionately impacting already marginalized groups.
It's like the system is rigged.
That's a good way to put it. And Dr. Hoerricks argues that the SFDV Act fits right into this historical narrative.
Of control and exclusion.
They see it as part of this bigger playbook used to maintain a certain power dynamic.
So who gets a say in how things are run?
Exactly. Who participates in the political process?
Which ultimately shapes the future of the country.
Yeah, if they can control who votes.
They can control the outcomes.
Right, and they can control the direction of the country.
It's kind of scary when you think about it like that.
It is. And what's interesting is that they argue this kind of move actually shows a weakness.
A weakness?
It's like they can't adapt to a changing society. So they're resorting back to these old tactics.
Exclusionary tactics.
Yeah, that's the word. Exclusionary. And because of that, they actually make this pretty strong call to action in the article.
What do they want people to do?
Well, resist the SAVE Act, any efforts to restrict voting rights.
Makes sense, but what does that look like in practice?
Well, they frame it as both a feminist issue and a democratic issue.
Both are important.
It's about protecting the rights of women and marginalized groups, for sure.
Yeah.
But it's also about protecting the very foundation of a fair government.
So it's bigger than just voting.
Absolutely. It's about standing up for what you believe in.
Making your voice heard.
Yeah, and fighting for a more just and inclusive system.
And they bring it back to the story of James Barrie.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that people have always found ways to resist oppressive systems.
Even when the odds are totally stacked against them.
Like Barrie had to literally disguise himself
Yeah.
to achieve their dream.
And now Dr. Hoerricks is suggesting that we might need to be just as bold in our own ways.
Exactly. We may not need to wear disguises, but we do need to find creative ways to resist these new forms of exclusion.
So instead of changing our appearance,
We're changing the system.
we're demanding to be seen and heard.
And we're fighting for a future where everyone has an equal chance to shape our society.
That's powerful.
Dr. Hoerricks really drives home the importance of collective action.
It's not just about what one person does.
Right. Individual acts of resistance are important, but real change happens when we come together as a force.
United we stand, divided we fall right.
Exactly. And when something like the SAVE Act is designed to divide and conquer,
That unity becomes even more important.
it's crucial, We need to recognize that we're all in this together.
Because when one group's rights are under attack,
It threatens the rights of everyone.
it's like Dr. Hoerricks is saying we can all be modern-day James Berries.
I love that idea.
We don't have to wear disguises.
But we do need to be bold
And challenge the status quo.
and find those creative ways to resist and make sure our voices are heard.
That's a great way to sum it up. They want us to look at these issues, even the ones that seem bureaucratic and technical.
Right, the ones that seem boring.
And see the power dynamics that are at play.
Don't take anything at face value.
Question your assumptions.
Recognize those historical patterns.
And fight for a better future.
A more inclusive, more equitable future.
Wow, that's a lot to think about.
We've covered a lot of ground.
From the specifics of the SAVE Act to the historical context.
And even to this amazing story of James Berry.
What a journey.
And it's really striking how Dr. Hoerricks weaves it all together.
They take this one piece of legislation and connect it to these larger issues.
Power, control, the fight for equality.
It's a deep dive in the truest sense of the word.
And I think the author's personal connection to all of this makes it even more powerful.
You can feel the urgency in their writing.
It's a reminder that these aren't just abstract political debates.
These issues have real consequences for real people.
And we all have a stake in this conversation.
We all have a role to play in shaping the future.
Absolutely.
Okay, so as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's the one thing you really want our listener to take away from this today?
I'd say it's this. Never underestimate the power of challenging the status quo. James Berry's story shows us that.
They refused to let society dictate their path, and they ended up blazing a trail for others.
And even when it feels like the system is rigged against you,
There's always hope.
there's always the possibility of pushing back and creating a better world. And it's all about preventing voter fraud. That's their main argument.
Right, got to make sure the elections are secure.
But here's the thing. Dr. Hoerricks points out that actual cases of voter fraud
Yeah.
are super rare.
Like, how rare are we talking?
Statistically insignificant, that's what they say.
Wow.
But by making it sound like this huge problem.
This big, scary boogeyman.
Exactly. It creates this sense of urgency, like we need to take drastic measures.
So it's not really about solving a real problem.
It's about creating this fear.
To justify stricter rules.
And those rules just happen to disproportionately impact certain groups.
The same groups we've been talking about.
Exactly. And it gets even more interesting. Dr. Hoerricks actually compares the whole thing to
Okay, this should be good.
a capitalist monopoly scheme.
Wow, okay, how so?
Instead of controlling a market,
They're trying to control the voters.
the electorate, control who gets to participate.
So if they can control who votes,
They can control who wins.
and ultimately control the direction of the country.
That's the point they're making.
That's a little unsettling, to be honest.
It is. It's like this power grab.
And they're using this fear of voter fraud to justify it.
Exactly. And what's even more interesting is they say this actually reveals a weakness.
A weakness in the SAVE Act?
Well, a weakness in this whole approach to politics. It's like they can't keep up with a changing society.
So they're resorting to these old tactics.
Exclusion, fear-mongering, it's all very familiar.
Like they're clinging to the past.
Trying to hold on to power.
Yeah, it's like they're afraid of losing control.
That's a good way to put it.
So what does Dr. Hoerricks suggest we do about all of this?
Well, they had this really powerful call to action in the article.
I bet they do.
They urge readers to resist the SAVE Act, any efforts to restrict voting rights.
Okay, resist, that makes sense. But what does that look like? What can people actually do?
Well, they frame it as both a feminist issue and a democratic issue.
So it's about protecting women's rights.
Yes, and the rights of all marginalized groups.
But it's also bigger than that.
It's about protecting the very foundation of a fair and representative government.
So it's not just about this one law.
It's about standing up for what you believe in,
Making your voice heard.
fighting for a system that works for everyone.
And they tie it back to the story of James Berry.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that people have always found ways to resist oppressive systems.
Even when it seems impossible.
Like Berry had to literally disguise themselves just to achieve their dream.
And in a way, Dr. Hoerricks is saying that we might need to be just as bold and creative.
We may not need to wear disguises.
But we do need to find ways to fight back against these new forms of exclusion.
So instead of changing our appearance,
We're changing the system.
we're demanding to be seen and heard.
And we're fighting for a future where everyone has an equal chance to shape our society.
That's the goal.
And Dr. Hoerricks really emphasizes the importance of collective action.
It's not just about what one person does.
It's about coming together.
Individual acts of resistance are important, but real change happens when we unite.
United we stand, divided we fall right.
Exactly. And when you have something like the SAVE Act that's designed to divide us,
That unity becomes even more important.
absolutely crucial. We need to recognize that we're all in this together.
Because when one group's rights are under attack,
It threatens the rights of everyone.
it's like Dr. Hoerricks is saying we can all be modern-day James Berries.
That's a great way to put it.
We may not have to wear disguises.
But we do need to be bold.
Courageous.
Challenge the status quo.
And find those creative ways to resist and make sure our voices are heard.
Don't be afraid to speak up.
That's the message.
And don't take anything at face value. Question everything.
Especially the things that seem obvious or simple.
Because there might be more going on beneath the surface.
There are always power dynamics at play.
Always. So learn to recognize those patterns.
And then do something about it.
Fight for a better future.
The more inclusive future.
Where everyone has a chance to thrive.
Okay, so we've been talking about how the SAVE Act, how it might not be what it seems, and how it connects to this bigger idea of control and exclusion. But what does that mean for, for people like you and me just going about our day? How can we use these insights in our own lives?
That's a great question. And I think Dr. Hoerricks would probably say it starts with, becoming a more critical thinker. Like, don't just accept things at face value.
Right.
Look beyond the surface. Ask yourself, who benefits from this?
Yeah.
And who might be disadvantaged? It's about seeing those power dynamics that are always there, just kind of hidden under the surface.
It's like they're giving us these new lenses to see the world with.
Exactly, like these X-ray glasses to see the structures and systems we might not have noticed before.
And those connections between seemingly separate issues.
Exactly. Remember we were talking about the SAVE Act, and they connected to things like Project 2025 and the Tradwife movement. It's about seeing the patterns, understanding how these things are all related.
Yeah, and once you start to see it, it's hard to unsee it.
That's the thing about critical thinking and historical awareness. It changes how you see everything.
So true. Okay, well, let's bring this all home now as we wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah.
What's the one thing you want our listener to take away from this conversation today?
I think the biggest takeaway, it's got to be to never underestimate the importance of challenging the status quo.
Ooh, that's a good one.
James Berry's story is a perfect example of that.
Yeah. They just wouldn't let societal norms dictate their path.
They wouldn't let anyone tell them what they could and couldn't do, and they paved the way for so many others.
It's a good reminder that even when it seems like the system is against you, it's not over.
There's always a chance for change. There's always hope.
And that change often starts with asking questions.
Right, questioning everything.
Examining our own assumptions and refusing to be silent when we see something wrong.
And remember, your voice matters. You have more power than you realize.
So as you go about your day today, dear listener, think about the things we've talked about today.
Think about those connections.
What hidden patterns are you starting to see now? And how can you use your voice and your actions
To make a difference,
to create a more just and equitable world?
you might be surprised by what you discover.
Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep fighting for what you believe in.
That's what makes a deep dive like this so worthwhile.
Until next time.